Have you ever walked away from an argument, having said everything that needed to be said, yet still felt like the one who lost? Have you ever felt your throat tighten after justifying, defending, and explaining yourself, as if the more you spoke, the more your inner strength drained away? You're not alone, because this world runs on noise. The one who talks more wins. The one who reacts faster is deemed right. Since childhood, we've been taught that you must explain to be understood. You must argue back to earn respect. Silence is a weakness. Not reacting means surrender, but that is a collective illusion. If you gaze long enough into the abyss will gaze back into you. And in the depths of stillness, there are forces more powerful than words. Manipulators rely on your reactions to stay in control. Controllers feed off your predictability to maintain dominance. But the moment you stop reacting, you break the entire game. Silence is not retreat. It is a quiet counterattack. Not responding does not mean you're weak. It means you're discerning about where your energy belongs. And when you are calm enough not to need to win every argument, you begin to truly win. The kind of victory that comes from mastering yourself. This series is for you, the one who was overlooked because you were too kind, the one who got hurt because you tried to explain, the one who got pulled into someone else's game simply because you didn't know how to step out. Today, you'll relearn a forgotten power, the power of non-reaction. 1. Reaction, the manifestation of a fragile ego. Have you ever wondered why you feel the urge to respond immediately when someone says something untrue about you? Why can a single offhand comment keep you awake all night, crafting the perfect response? The answer doesn't lie in the words they said, but in a deeper psychological mechanism. Reaction is the clearest sign of an ego that has not yet been mastered. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And one of the most common expressions of the unconscious is an impulsive reaction. Reaction, in its deepest sense, is not an intentional act. It is an unconscious activation. Someone touches a wound inside you that hasn't healed, and your body, your mind, your emotions leap up like a threatened child. You speak, you justify, you get angry, you feel hurt, all just to avoid facing an inner emotion you've never truly sat with. The feeling of not being enough, of being wrong, of not being seen. Why does silence make you so uncomfortable? Because it denies you the chance to control how others see you. A fragile ego lives on the gaze of others. It needs validation to survive, and when attacked, it can't bear being misunderstood, so it reacts. But there is a paradox that both Nietzsche and Jung pointed out. The more you react, the more you reveal your weakness. Every justification is a sign that you are still dependent on others' opinions. Every counterattack is an unconscious message that says, "I don't trust myself enough to remain silent." Strong people are not those who feel nothing. They feel deeply, but they do not let emotion dictate their actions. They understand that in the psychological game, the quickest reaction is the weakest move, because when you react, you are already being controlled. Silence is not passive. Silence is a choice not to react, not to be pulled into the spiral of someone else's ego. It's the moment when you stop acting from instinct and start responding as someone who owns their energy. Silence demands that you stay grounded. In the face of provocation, it asks you to withstand the doubtful glances, the sarcastic remarks, and the pain of being misunderstood without losing your internal compass. It is a form of strength that only those who have walked through their own darkness can possess. Nietzsche called this the stance of the Übermensch, the one who no longer lives by the moral standards of the crowd, who no longer reacts to prove anything to anyone. They live by the code of their own inner truth, and that makes them invulnerable. So next time you feel the urge to react, pause. Observe what part of you is being triggered. Is it the fear of being misunderstood, the pain of being dismissed, or an ego that still longs to be healed? If you can simply remain still in that moment, no words, no retaliation, no justification, you've already won over your own ego. And in that moment, you are no longer a puppet of your emotions. You are their conductor. That is the first step toward mastering silence and mastering yourself. 2. Non-reaction. You've broken the manipulator's game. This world is governed by energy, not by noise. Every argument and every confrontation takes place on an unseen energetic field. Who is attracting? Who is projecting? Who is being pulled in? Who is being manipulated? Carl Jung summarized a profound paradox. In depth psychology, those who need to manipulate are the weakest. A person who seeks to control others often cannot control themselves. They use words to criticize and fragment, a glance to imply, a silence to pressure you into reacting, because only when you react can they maintain control of the game. But what happens if you stop altogether? No explanation, no argument, no justification, no reply, just meet them with a calm smile or a steady gaze that doesn't waver. In that moment, the manipulator experiences an unconscious collapse. They forget that, without an audience to witness their performance, the stage crumbles. They begin to speak more, lose control, reveal more of their fear, because your non-reaction has broken the entire manipulation mechanism. Silence has a sharper edge than any verbal weapon. It's particularly potent against those who are used to manipulating others emotionally. To maintain psychological power, when you fall silent, they no longer know where to land their strike. And when their strikes don't land, they become afraid of being exposed. There are many familiar forms of manipulation: talking behind your back in public, sowing seeds of doubt, subtle ridicule, playing the helpless victim, only to turn around and blame you. But the most skillful manipulators need only a loaded look or a casual remark, crafted precisely to trigger your reaction. They don't need to win the argument. They only need you to lose control. Yet when you understand the power of non-reaction, you become the only person in the room who can control their own energy. Every distortion, every sarcastic remark, every subtle tactic becomes powerless in the face of your composed gaze and unwavering silence. Silence becomes a mirror. Whoever looks into it will see themselves. Those who love you will see a peaceful spirit. Manipulators will see regret or the shadow of themselves being rejected. And at that moment, silence is no longer a weapon. It becomes the language of one who has mastered themselves. Free. Silence is the language of those who have transcended the need for validation. There is a kind of person who walks into a room and, without saying a word, draws every gaze, not because they try to attract attention, but because their very presence carries a kind of energy that causes others to take a step back, equal parts curiosity and caution. This is not the silence of avoidance or passivity. It is the silence born of a ripened inner world, a silence that no longer needs to be heard, understood, or validated, a silence that holds its own without proving anything. In a world where everyone is trying to be seen, through words, achievements, social media, or fiery debates, the silent ones wield a paradoxical power. The less they speak, the more we want to hear them. The less they seek recognition, the more we take notice. Why? Because they no longer operate from lack, but from inner sufficiency. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "The strong do not need to be understood. They only need to be free." And the greatest freedom is this: to no longer be ruled by the desire for acknowledgement, that quiet yet powerful hunger for validation. As long as you still crave being understood, you will keep explaining. As long as you're afraid of being misunderstood, you will keep reacting. But once you rise above that, you enter a different state, where you simply exist, without justification, without needing agreement, without fishing for praise. At that moment, you begin to speak the language of those who have moved beyond ego. The language of silence. Silence is not the absence of words. It is the refusal to expend energy on conversations that don't matter. It is the conscious choice in a noisy world where everyone fights to be right. Those who no longer seek recognition do not win with words. They win with stillness, with eyes that do not react, with a posture that does not explain. They do not speak, yet you feel them. They say nothing, yet their presence cannot be ignored. In truth, much of what we say, in relationships, at work, or on social media, carries an invisible agenda: to be seen, to be acknowledged, to prove we are right, enough, worthy. But the language of the awakened is not in their words. It's in the moments they choose not to speak. And within that silence, they send a message more powerful than any sentence. I don't need to win over you. I've already won over myself. You cannot manipulate someone who doesn't need validation. You cannot control someone who doesn't seek approval. And you certainly cannot destabilize someone who doesn't need to stand out. That's what makes them invulnerable. Not because they shut down, but because they've outgrown the need to be acknowledged in order to exist. So how do you access that kind of silence? You must be willing to sit with yourself when you're misunderstood, willing to remain quiet when you're under attack, willing to hold your truth even when you know you're right and still not defend it. But most importantly, you must learn to stay grounded in the absence of recognition without letting it shake your sense of worth. And once you can do that, you'll realize silence is no longer a form of suppression. It is a powerful choice, the language of someone who is awake enough to no longer prove anything, because their very presence has become living evidence of inner strength. 4. Modern psychology. Why silence disturbs people. At first glance, silence seems like the mere absence of sound, but in the deeper dimensions of modern psychology, silence is a phenomenon of immense power. The right silence, at the right moment, can disturb someone far more than 100 counter-arguments, not because it's avoidance, but because it forces the other person to confront themselves, something few are truly ready for. According to research in psychoanalysis and social psychology, most human communication isn't driven by the desire to share. It's driven by the desire to control, to direct the other person's reactions, to persuade, to maintain dominance in the relationship. When you don't react, you deactivate their entire defense system, and without predictability, the person across from you falls into a state of deep anxiety. Carl Jung once said, "What is not made conscious will manifest as fate." When you stay silent, you don't behave in ways they can predict. That awakens their unconscious. They begin to project, casting onto you all their assumptions, fears, and insecurities. They no longer see you. They see their own fear reflected in the stillness you've created. Social psychology calls this unresolved cognitive dissonance. The human brain is wired to seek closure when a situation lacks a clear response, especially when someone expects you to react, argue, explain, cry, or agree. Your silence short-circuits their analytical system. They can't decipher what you're thinking. They can't place you in their mental framework, and that makes them feel threatened. Silence also activates the amygdala, the fear processing center of the brain. The person speaking to you is no longer focused on logic or reason. They begin operating from emotional defense. They may become angry, irritated, or even lash out, but in truth, they're reacting to the uncertainty your silence creates. They are no longer in control, and that terrifies them. The fascinating thing is, silence doesn't need to be prolonged to have this effect. A well-placed pause, a wordless glance, even a message left unanswered, can trigger it, but this must be clearly understood. This is not punishment, it is the act of withdrawing your energy from a manipulative exchange. You are choosing not to react to provocation, you are choosing not to empower toxicity, and that alone changes the psychological playing field entirely. Behavioral psychology also shows us this. Other people's reactions are not really about you. They're about their own fear. When you remain silent, they lose their escape route. They're forced to ask themselves questions like, did I say something wrong? What are they thinking? Am I losing value in their eyes? And these questions pull them into the very place they've always avoided. Inside themselves, silence isn't about proving yourself. Silence is about anchoring yourself. It is a state in which you no longer need validation from the external world. And while others scramble in the chaos of their inner storms, you remain still, wordless, whole. Once you understand how silence impacts the psychology of others, you stop being drawn into games of rhetoric. You no longer seek victory through debate, because the most powerful truth is the one that needs no proof. 5. When silence becomes a deliberate strategy, you've entered the realm of mastery. Silence is often misunderstood as a sign of weakness, the mark of someone lacking in arguments, lacking in strength to speak up. But in reality, especially in the deeper lens of psychology, silence, when chosen consciously, is the purest expression of inner power. It is no longer avoidance. It is strategy, no longer an unconscious reflex, but the endgame move of someone who has seen the entire board. When you choose silence not out of fear, but because you know the weight of your words, you enter a completely different psychological state. You are no longer driven by emotions, no longer entangled in the need to prove yourself, no longer chasing recognition. You simply stand still, silent, and allow others to reveal themselves. That's when you no longer seize power, because power naturally gathers around you. Carl Jung once said, "The truly strong are not those without a shadow, but those who have integrated it." And from that integration arises a depth of silence, a kind of stillness that cannot be broken by external agitation. The more someone embraces silence, the less they express themselves impulsively, the more they disturb those who face them, because others can no longer predict or control them, especially in toxic dynamics. Where manipulation thrives on emotional triggers and unconscious strains, silence becomes the act of stepping off the stage, collapsing every pre-written script. When you stop reacting, the manipulator no longer knows what to put in your mouth. When you refuse to argue, to defend, to explain, they are forced to sit with themselves. There's no one left to blame, no one left to project onto, no mirror left to reflect the wounds they've tried so hard to hide. But make no mistake, silence is not an escape for the weak. It demands a very high level of awareness, because humans are naturally reactive, especially when insulted, misunderstood, or threatened. Only when you've risen beyond that reactive layer, when you are no longer ruled by your fragile ego, can you hold silence from a place of power. At this point, silence is no longer an absence. It becomes a field of energy. A vibration is so stable that it forces others to adjust their frequency. There are meetings where no one remembers what was said, but the quiet gaze of the person who sat in silence at the end of the table changes the entire tone of the room, because silence, when used intentionally and at the right energetic depth, becomes the most powerful declaration of all. Those who master silence are those who have mastered their energy. They are not dragged by words, by emotion, or by scripts written by someone else. They don't need to raise their voice to be heard. They don't need to explain to be understood. They don't need to perform to be validated, because they know what is truly solid does not need to be displayed. And when you reach this state, when silence becomes a tool, used consciously, strategically, and selectively, you've entered a different tier of self-mastery, the level of the sovereign, not one who dominates with words, but one who influences through presence, not by control, but by invisible gravity. Because in a world that is noisy and reaction-prone, the one who can remain calm, centered, and silent is the one who cannot be manipulated, and that, without needing to be said, will always be felt. 6. False silence, the risk of being exploited. Not all silence is a sign of inner strength. There exists a different kind of silence, one that appears calm on the outside, but in truth is born from withdrawal, fear, and distorted adaptation. This is false silence, a silence not born of freedom, but rooted in a suppressed past, in wounds that never had the chance to be spoken. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Silence, when not accompanied by awareness, easily becomes a kind of moral shadow. You are good, you are gentle, you are considerate, but inside, you are angry, sad, wounded, and deeply alone. In analytical psychology, this is the manifestation of a repressed shadow. Negative emotions, unmet needs, violated boundaries, all hidden beneath the mask of silence. You don't speak up, not because you've mastered yourself, but because you don't believe your voice has value. And that's when silence becomes a crack in the soul. The danger is, society admires the quiet, the patient, the self-sacrificing, without discerning between self-mastery and self-erasure. This is why those who practice false silence are often the ones exploited. In families, they are given the role of peacemaker, of endurer. In relationships, they're the easygoing ones, low maintenance. At work, they carry the load but never receive the recognition. And tragically, they feel guilty for asking for their rights, for expressing emotions, for setting boundaries, because deep down, they've been conditioned to believe, I am only lovable when I'm not a burden. I am only accepted when I endure well. That is not silence, that is self-erasure, when your silence stems from fear of disappointing others, fear of being abandoned, or fear of not being accepted. You are nurturing an ecosystem in which manipulators, controllers, and the selfish thrive, because they sense, you won't push back, you won't say no, you won't dare walk away. And they use that to wear you down while still keeping you close. Through the very niceness you've been praised for, false silence, if prolonged, causes you to lose touch with your true feelings. You no longer distinguish between authentic needs and fear-driven compliance. You nod when you want to shake your head. You smile when you want to cry. You agree when you feel utterly conflicted. Little by little, you're no longer yourself. You become a polished shell, a nice person, so edited it down that your own identity has vanished. So, how can you tell the difference between conscious silence and silence that invites exploitation? If your silence brings peace, it is a power. If your silence brings emptiness, fatigue, and resentment, it is a dangerous compromise. And if you cannot say no, cannot express how you truly feel, cannot walk away from what wounds you, then that silence isn't as noble as you think. It is merely the consequence of unhealed pain. Carl Jung once warned, "We cannot change anything until we accept it." Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses, and false silence, no matter how well dressed in morality or reason, is still a form of self-oppression, a subtle act of self-condemnation. Only when you dare to speak, dare to set boundaries, dare to walk away from a place of awareness, love, and self-respect, does your silence truly become the weapon of the strong. Everything else that remains misunderstood is merely darkness borrowing the disguise of calm. 7. True silence, the result of an integrated self. There is a kind of silence that does not come from pressing your lips shut, nor from suppressing the storm of anger rising in your chest. It is the silence of someone who has nothing left to prove, nothing left to hide, and no one left to please. An inner stillness, not born of avoidance of the world, but of deep self-understanding. Carl Jung once said, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And when that inner darkness has been acknowledged, engaged with, and embraced, then the noise of the world no longer has a reason to disturb you. That is the moment one reaches integration, between light and shadow, between ego and unconscious, between the image we wish to become and the parts we once rejected. True silence is not the absence of words. It is the voluntary withdrawal of an ego that no longer needs to argue. It does not come from weakness, but from an understanding of the limits of language. It does not stem from a need for defense, but from a deep inner safety, a knowing that you have nothing to lose, and no need to win. To reach such a state of silence, one must journey through a profound and often painful path. The journey of facing every part of yourself you once felt ashamed of, once denied, once tried to bury in order to be loved, to be accepted. But one day, you realize, no one in this world can fill the emptiness inside you, except yourself. And so you stop, not because you're out of strength, but because you've come to understand. You understand that arguing more doesn't necessarily reveal the truth. Reacting strongly is not always a sign of strength. Convincing others doesn't make you deeper. It only makes you more dependent on how they see you. And it is precisely when you release the need for recognition that you begin to truly be present. You listen not to refute, but to understand. You observe not to judge, but to connect. And you stay silent, not because you have no words, but because every word now requires a reason deep enough to be spoken. This silence baffles others, because they can't read you, can't manipulate you, can't get you to react the way they want. You become unpredictable, not because you're hiding, but because you no longer play a role in their script. You are no longer a supporting character in someone else's emotional play. You become the author of your own story. Jung called this psychic wholeness, when a person is no longer divided by inner opposites, no longer chasing the gaze of others, no longer retreating from their own deepest emotions. At that point, your very presence carries weight. No need to shout, no need to prove it. All you need is to be, the unified self that no longer requires justification. This silence is not a tool, not a tactic, but the purest expression of a healed inner life. And because of that, it becomes the most enduring form of power. A power not derived from controlling others, but from mastering oneself. When you walk into a room and remain silent, yet all eyes turn toward you, that is the moment your presence has replaced the need for words. When someone insults you, mocks you, or tries to manipulate you, and you don't react, don't get pulled into the emotional game, that is when you sever the strings of their control. Non-reaction doesn't mean you don't feel. On the contrary, it shows that you feel deeply, and have learned to choose what is truly worthy of your presence. You no longer rush to explain yourself just to be understood. You no longer need words to prove your worth, because you yourself are the living evidence of maturity. Nietzsche did not write for the fragile who seek comfort. He wrote for the souls courageous enough to alchemize pain into power, wounds into wisdom, and silence into sovereignty. From this day on, let silence become your companion, not the silence of someone who is defeated, but the silence of someone who has claimed the deepest freedom there is. The freedom not to speak, and still be respected. If something in this series of reflections has touched a part of truth within you, leave a comment. I choose sovereign silence, not so others may see it, but so you may affirm that a transformation has begun within. And remember, the weak scream is to be noticed. The strong, they simply remain silent, and the world begins to orbit around them.